Okay, what is up there, YouTube? This is J-Man Time, and today I have a video on American tankettes of World War I, the interwar years, and World War II. When it comes to tankettes, most historians usually don't cover the American tankettes. Tankettes were a class of very small, almost goat cart-like tank that was used by most armies in the early 1900s, all the way up until World War II, with some countries like the US using tankettes all the way up until the end of the Vietnam War. Tankettes were more popular in the British, French, Soviet, and Imperial Japanese armies during the years before and during World War II. But American tankettes are rarely talked about, and the main reason being is that the US never used the term tankette to describe any of their tankette-like vehicles. Instead, most tankettes designed in the US were usually considered light tanks or some kind of a light armored vehicle. So let's go over some of the rare American tankettes that had been in use or were designed since the end of World War I until the end of the Vietnam War. And the first true American tankette was the American Ford 3-ton tank from 1917 and 1918. And this was actually a series of experimental tankettes that were designed for American forces during the First World War, although none of the vehicles made it to the front line during World War I. These vehicles were produced by the Ford Motor Company alongside the Ford 6-ton tank, which was the American copy of the French Renault FT-17 light tank. These vehicles were armed with one 7.62mm M19-17 Browning machine gun, or some were armed with the original version of the M1919 Browning machine gun, which was not called the M1919 until 1919, the year after World War I. The armor thickness was 7 to 13 millimeters, and these tankettes had a speed of 12.8 kilometers per hour, or 8 miles per hour, and had a crew of 2. Originally, the U.S. Army ordered about 15,000 of these tanks between 1917 and early 1918, and these were supposed to be used during the 100 Days Offensive against the German forces in France and Belgium. But only 15 tanks were completed by the time the armistice was signed in November 1918. These original 15 vehicles continued to be used as training vehicles for a few years after World War I, but ultimately most of them were scrapped, and only a handful, at least 3 of these tankettes, still survive today. The Ford 3-ton tank was almost the most advanced American tankette for a good 28 to 30 years, until at least World War II. The vehicle could have been useful in World War I, especially since it was so small and had a very low silhouette, which would have made it much harder for the Germans to spot, let alone take out. One of the main problems with the 3-ton tank was crossing trenches. It could cross some of the shallow trenches, but deep, muddy trenches seemed to be a problem for this tankette. As a result, only 15 of the tankettes were completed due to the fact that the Americans were trying to figure out a way to overcome this one obstacle. One of the ways they wanted to do this is to extend the length of the tank, but they never got around to doing it, and only the original 15 prototypes were built. And after 1918, the Army no longer wanted the original order of 15,000 tankettes. As a result, the remaining vehicles were either scrapped or sold off, and only 3 vehicles survived to this very day. It was an interesting tankette concept. Like I said, it would have been useful. I always wondered what would have happened if the Americans had produced some 15,000 of these tankettes. How useful would these tankettes have been if they were still around during the Second World War? Let's hypothetically think or imagine a situation where these tankettes had to be used in World War II. Keep in mind, many of the old Ford 3-ton tanks, along with the original Renault FT-17 light tanks, were still in use in World War II, especially in France and especially in Asia. So many of these vehicles could have been exported during the interwar years, and they could have been useful in conflicts like China, between China and the Japanese, the Second Sino-Japanese War, and they could have been useful in the Philippines when the Japanese invaded the Philippines in 1942. And only 15 of these vehicles were completed. The next tankette developed by the U.S. was actually made by the Holt Tractor Company. For those of you who don't know, the Holt Tractor Company was one of the main supplier engines and components for American tanks and French tanks during the First World War. In 1917, they actually came up with their own experimental tankette, known as the Halt HA-36 One-Man Tank. And this was actually a technology demonstrator tankette that was developed in 1917 and was built in 1918. The tankette was supposed to be armed with two 37mm guns, but ultimately Holt would use two mock-up guns instead of the actual 37mm gun. The armor thickness is unknown, and the speed is largely unknown, and the vehicle only had a crew of one. Now, the vehicle actually did appear during the Victory Day parade at the end of 1918 when World War I came to an end and many Americans were celebrating. It was one of many experimental tanks that were showcased to the American public at the very end of World War I in order to show the American public what the U.S. could do if it were to take some of these tank concepts seriously. If World War I hadn't ended in 1918, then the Holt company could have gotten a contract to manufacture this one-man tankette. And it would have been the most powerful tankette. It would have been armed with two 37mm French SA-18 guns, which were the same guns used on the Renault FT-17, or it could have been armed with a new 37mm gun that was never unveiled. It was a pretty interesting tankette concept. It was much smaller than the average light tank and was roughly the same size as the Ford 3-ton tank, except this vehicle here was much more powerful. In terms of its design, it was clearly a copy of the British Mark 1 through 5 series of rhomboid-shaped medium tanks or heavy tanks. The next tankette developed by the U.S. was designed by J. Walter Christie. J. Walter Christie was an American entrepreneur who would go on to develop the J. Walter Christie suspension system, and he would also go to the Soviet Union and sell many of his tank concepts to the USSR, and the USSR would later on reverse engineer many of those tanks to become some of the standard Soviet tanks of World War II. For example, the Soviet BT-2, BT-5, and BT-7, and the early model T-26 light tanks were all based on the Christie experimental tanks of the 1920s and 30s. But one of Christie's forgotten tanks were the Christie Airborne combat car from 1933. This was an experimental light airborne wheel-tracked self-propelled gun tankette that was developed for the U.S. Air Force in the early 1930s. The main armament would have been either a 37 or 57mm short gun. The armor thickness and speed is unknown, but the vehicle could have a crew of one or two. Now, in the 1920s and 30s, Christie was experimenting with the idea of creating an airborne tank. He even came up with the idea of creating a flying tank. This was a tank that also doubled as an airplane. So this combat car was one of those experimental Air Force tanks, and is one of the few tankettes that he actually developed. In fact, this was the only true tankette developed by J. Walter Christie, who mostly developed light and medium tanks. This tank concept was unveiled to the U.S. military, but ultimately the U.S. rejected this design, just like they rejected most of Walter Christie's experimental tanks. One of the main reasons being is the armor was too thin and the vehicle was way too fast for what the Army was looking for. As a result, the project was pretty much terminated by 1934, but Christie would continue to develop more tanks all the way up until the middle of World War II in 1943. The next experimental tankette was the Cunningham T-1, and this was an experimental tankette that was developed by the James Cunningham and Son Company between 1927 and 1928. It was actually developed alongside the T-1 Cunningham light tank, which was a series of experimental light tanks also designed between 1927 and 1932. And just like the light tank, this tankette didn't really get very far in terms of development. It was a very small tankette when compared to the other vehicles on the list. Its main armament was only one 7.62mm Browning M1917 or M1919 light machine gun. The armor thickness was very thin, only 3.17mm thick, so machine gun bullets could cut right through this tankette with no problem. The speed was 31 kilometers per hour, or 19.2 miles per hour, and it had a crew of 2. And only one known prototype was ever made of the Cunningham T-1 tank development chassis, or Tankette, from 1928. What happened to this Tankette after 1928 is unknown, and it is also unknown if it was actually tested by the US military. And the Tankette seems to have been either scrapped or just lost to history. The next series of experimental tankettes, or in this case limited production tankettes, actually come from the Marmon-Herrington Company. During World War II, the Marmon-Herrington Company was known for making tanks and armored cars for both the US and British armed forces, especially during the battles of North Africa. They also made export tanks for countries like Iran, Poland, Mexico, China, and the Dutch East Indies, or the Dutch colonies. And they also tried to make tanks for France. Now, in the mid-1930s, Marmon-Herrington came up with a series of tankettes known as the CTL series, and these consisted of the CTL-1, CTL-2, CTL-3, and the CTL-4 series of tankettes, all the way up until the CTL-6, and there was also an offshoot tankette known CTVL. Now, the first 2 tankettes were known as the CTL-1 and CTL-2. These were 2 experimental light tankettes that were developed for Poland, actually. In the mid-1930s, Poland was buying up experimental vehicles from various countries, and they also ordered some experimental vehicles from the US, including this Marmon-Herrington CTL-1 and CTL-2. Ultimately, Poland would reject the CTL-1 and 2 prototypes in favor of the British Vickers tank and their own tanks, the Tankettes and 70P series of tankettes and light tanks. So only one prototype of the CTL-1 was built for Poland, and several prototypes of the CTL-2. After Poland rejected the offer, the US would go on to sell some of these tankettes to Iran, and Persia would use those tankettes during the Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran in 1941. The US would continue to experiment with the CTL-1 and 2 series of tankettes until they came up with the CTL-2 and 3, and also the CTVL series of tankettes. Some of these tankettes were also sold to Mexico. Mexico and many Central and South American countries were lacking tanks and were buying tanks from the US. They were buying whatever tanks they could find for the cheap, and these tankettes were on sale for a very cheap price. The CTL-1 through 6 series had a main armament of either 7.62mm Browning M1919 machine guns. The armor thickness was usually 6.35mm thick, and the vehicles usually had a speed of 53 kilometers per hour, or 35 miles per hour, and they had a crew of either 1 to 3. Only a few dozen of these tankettes were constructed, and some of them were sold to Iran, and some of them were also sold to Mexico and a few other Central American countries. Mexico would also purchase another Marmon-Herrington tankette, the aforementioned CTVL, and this was an experimental tankette from 1937, or a limited production tankette from 1937. It was armed with 2 7.62mm Browning M1919 machine guns and had an increased armor thickness of 12.7mm. The speed was 48 kilometers per hour, or 45 miles per hour, and it had a crew of 2 or 3. And a few dozen of these were also sold to Mexico and were used by the U.S. Armed Forces as training vehicles during the Second World War. Marmon-Herrington would go on to make a series of light tanks known as the CTLS-4, and this would be their most successful series, but those were not true tankettes, but they were used in World War II, especially by the US and by the Dutch forces, and the CTLS-4 was based on the original CTL-1 and CTVL series of experimental tankettes, or limited production tankettes. And that brings us to the final vehicle on the list. The final tankette to be developed by the US and actually used in combat, and that is the M50 Ontos. The Ontos was a limited production tank destroyer tankette from 1952, so this is in the Cold War era, and these tankettes went into production in 1955. They were recoilless gun tankettes. They were armed with either 4 to 6 recoilless guns, and their jobs were to take out many of the early Cold War era Soviet tanks like the T-54-55 and the P-76 light tank. The main armament of the M50 Ontos was 6 106mm M40A1C recoilless guns, or recoilless rifles. The armor penetration of these recoilless guns were anywhere from 300 to 400mm, meaning they could take out most of the early Soviet tanks up until at least the later production T-72 tanks. The secondary armament was one 7.62mm Browning Model 1919 machine gun. The armor thickness is unknown, but the speed was 48 kilometers per hour or 30 miles per hour, and it had a crew of 3. In total, the U.S. would produce between 290 and 300 of the M50 Ontos. The Ontos would go on to serve in the Vietnam War with the U.S. Marines in Vietnam. In fact, the Ontos was so light that it could actually be carried by the CH-53 Sea Stallion utility transport helicopters, and these were heavy transport helicopters that were normally used to transport artillery pieces and supplies. Now, in Vietnam, the North Vietnamese Army, or the NVA, rarely used tanks for most of the conflict. In fact, they didn't really start receiving a large number of tanks from the Soviet Union and China until about 1968 and 1970. So for most of the Ontos' combat experience in Vietnam, they were mostly used as infantry support vehicles or direct fire support vehicles for use against enemy infantry rather than enemy armored fighting vehicles. Later on, they were also used in the Dominican Civil War in 1965. This was a civil war in the Dominican Republic. And during the Civil War, they actually encountered some Dominican light tanks that were produced by Sweden and France. These were the Swedish Landsverk L60L and the French AMX-13 series of light tanks. And the Ontos managed to take out a few of these light tanks during that conflict when the U.S. decided to intervene in the Dominican Civil War of 1965. In 1969, however, the Ontos was considered obsolete and was later decommissioned as a Tankette in the U.S. Armed Forces in 1969, pretty much putting an end to the Ontos. After 1969, most of these vehicles were scrapped, but there are some Ontos that still survive in various museums across the United States. And that's basically it. The U.S., like many countries, didn't really develop that many Tankettes because Tankettes weren't considered all that useful. In fact, the Americans preferred light tanks like the M3 and M5 Stewart over Tankettes overall. And so Tankettes were never taken seriously by the U.S., which is why only 2 series of Tankettes were ever used, and they were only produced in very small numbers. So which of these were your favorite? If I had to pick, my favorite would obviously be the first Tankette, the American Ford 3-ton tank, as that is my favorite of the U.S. Tankettes. Which of these were your favorite? Please tell me in the comments section below. And until next time, this was J-Man Time, signing off.